Just gonna hit record. So just a reminder, we did make a couple changes to some of the director's cut dates. And so one of them obviously was today. So thank you for being able to join. But then also we moved up, I believe, August date as well. So those are all posted in the Information Center on the Oil and Gas Division's website to take a look at those dates. Just keep an eye on that document. We'll keep it updated with the latest information. Otherwise, I will kick it over to Lynn for May's update.
Thank you, everyone, for coming to the Director's Cut and for tuning into the webinar. It's always good to visit with you about what's happening in the Bakken. And so we'll start off by talking a little bit about production, and then we've got a few other items to touch on. Pretty good recovery in production volumes. We got to 1.39 million in March. That's shy of the record, as you're fully aware. It represents almost a 65,000 barrel a day increase, which is a really good increase, but it still is about 13,000 barrels a day short of the record, which was set with the January production. You will recall that February was brutally winter in North Dakota, and so was the first half of March. I went back and checked. The website for looking at historical weather isn't as good as or as user-friendly as it used to be. It used to be easy to get the climate data. It's not so easy anymore, but I noticed that most of the first half of March was well sub-zero. And in fact, around March 9th and 10th, wind chills were 50 below in the oil patch, and there was literally nothing moving. So the first half of March really put a dent in production. I fully anticipate that starting with April, we'll get back to setting records. We've had really very favorable weather starting mid-March and running through today. And as far as I know, all the load restrictions are off. And so workover rigs, completion crews, water, drilling rigs, everything's moving at a rapid pace. And so we've seen a big uptick in some of the counties, like, for example, Mountrail County jumping to 12 rigs. So we've seen a lot of movement of drilling rigs around the patch. But more importantly, we're starting to see a lot of the workover and completion activity take off. And you can see that in the completion numbers that we presented there. I got to jump to the second page, but it was interesting to note that with the 62 completions in February, that's not, in fact, at 60 completions, we lose production. That March number is very preliminary. I found out that there's a backlog of completion reports that staff is working through. And so I think when it's all said and done, we're going to see March completion numbers more along the line of what we saw in January for that second half of March, which is a lot of the explanation for 65,000 barrel a day increase. What is probably more surprising is setting a new record in natural gas production. So oil production up 4%, natural gas up 6.5%. So a pretty rapid build in terms of natural gas production. And when I get to flaring, we'll talk about that. Well numbers are up. Permitting activity is pretty robust, pretty much normal activities. Somewhere between 110 and 130 permits coming in a month. Oil prices are relatively strong, but quite volatile the last few days. There's just so much going on around the world with the Chinese tariffs and the potential impact on their economy, the sabotage or attacks on crude oil tankers in the Gulf, the Arabian Gulf, and the Iran sanctions clamping down. I don't think anybody really knows what to expect in terms of oil prices, except that likely higher. I think all of the indicators are towards higher oil prices, which will drive activity and production up. But we have some constraints. Rig count has stayed very solid in the mid-60s. we're expecting that to grow. I hope to get down to Denver next month and talk with a group of our Denver operators and get their pulse on what they're thinking as we go into fall and winter and next year, what they're thinking about budgets for next year. So hopefully next month I can clue you in on kind of in general what they're saying about oil prices and activity expected for next year. Let's talk about gas capture and gas prices. Gas capture and gas prices are a real problem. Natural gas just continues to be decoupled from crude oil, and the prices are very weak. And so until we see a summer demand for natural gas to make electricity, to run air conditioners, natural gas prices are very weak. And I had the opportunity last week to be in Oklahoma City and meet with regulators from all around the United States and the Canadian provinces. And they're seeing the same kind of well performance in the Appalachian Basin and the Anadarko Basin that we're seeing here, where they're no longer shocked in Pennsylvania when a new horizontal well with a 3-mile lateral comes in at 100 million cubic feet a day. So there is just so much natural gas in the system that the prices just are they're weak, and they're going to stay pretty weak. And of course we have the bottleneck, which I think Justin can touch on, for natural gas liquids, trying to move those out of North Dakota. And until the natural gas liquid pipeline expansions really kick in, that's going to be a real dampener on natural gas. So all in all, gas capture and flaring is a struggle. And you saw that the percentage captured dropped a little bit. The volume captured is at a new all-time high. And so we can see the effect of like the Wild Basin plant coming on. Volume captured at a new all-time high, but production overran it. And that's going to be the story for the rest of this year, really. Until we get well into the fourth quarter of this year, we're not going to have the new natural gas infrastructure up and running. And so this is going to be a long and difficult battle. And you can see where our problem area is. It's in eastern McKenzie and northern Dunn County. It's predominantly Fort Berthold, and trying to move that gas all the way across McKenzie County or all the way up to Highway 2 or further to try to get it processed and get it into a pipeline. Our negotiations with BLM on implementing state rules for gas capture are at an impasse. We just are stuck on the definition of routine flaring, and our definitions are miles apart. So we're trying to figure out where to go next in terms of who we should be speaking with and how we may be working that out. I've got some emails I need to respond to this afternoon to try to break that log jam, and so we'll see if we can pull that off. But we're at a complete impasse over what constitutes routine flaring. We think of it as all these wells that are flaring for an extended period of time. The BLM's definition currently is only wells not connected to a pipeline. And correct me if I'm wrong, Justin, but that represents about 4% of our gas. And so for the state to try to step in and deal with just 4% of the gas isn't really an effective use of our time and efforts. And so we've got to somehow break this impasse over what really is routine flaring, and then it'll go one way or the other. Robust activity on the reservation, 15 drilling rigs, 11 of them on trust lands. I think you're seeing the effects of the tax agreement and the effects of some regulatory and tax certainty there for industry. You're also seeing the effects of remarkable wells. I mean, there was an announcement earlier this month that the highest U.S. onshore IP ever reported came from Antelope Field. Field's been on production since 1952, and we've got a well there that came in at a sustained rate above 10,000 barrels a day. So this new completion technology is just phenomenal in terms of the kind of yields that people are getting out of the new wells. Touch on Washington State Senate Bill 5579. That is the one dealing with crude by rail going into northwestern Washington. You heard what one of the Industrial Commission members said, which I think is pretty much consensus, and that is that the state of North Dakota virtually has to file a lawsuit over this. We truly believe that's a violation of the Interstate Commerce Clause, a violation of the federal preemption over railway regulations, and also a violation of the science behind vapor pressures and crude by rail. So that's the direction we're headed. That law will take effect July 28th of this year. So the effective date of the legislation based on Governor Inslee's signature is July 28th. We have a little time to kind of work out all the details of how this thing's going to move forward. There are a number of parties that want to intervene on the side of the state of North Dakota. And so we'll keep you posted as it moves forward. But that's where we're headed with near 100% certainty. You did see, as a result of the bad weather in the first half of March, that wells waiting on completion jumped quite remarkably, and inactive wells jumped. And so we saw waiting on completion back to almost 1,000 wells, 968 wells waiting for a completion crew, and almost 1,700 inactive. And that's just a weather phenomenon. Like I said, with the load restrictions coming off, that we're starting to see increased number of frac crews working. They're back into the mid-20s and climbing. So, and that was in March, or by the end of March, they were back into the mid-20s. So we ought to see 40, 50 frac crews operating in North Dakota through the summer. The main constraint there is going to be gas capture, and then behind that, workforce. But all in all, robust activity. One other thing I wanted to mention, and it's way back here. There's an item that in another month will be coming off the director's cut, and you see it. Help me out, Katie. Where's the EPA item on RCRA? Way back here on page 8 and 9. Starts on page 8 and rolls over to page 9. So we'll actually be able to shorten the thing. But you recall that there was a lawsuit about 4 years ago, almost 4 years ago, of the EPA over waste rules. And there was a consent decree between the suing parties, the plaintiffs, and the EPA. North Dakota tried to intervene in that, and we were told no. We tried to go through the courts to intervene, and we were told no. The consent decree was put in place and certified by the judge. EPA did their review, and the report was published on the 28th of April, 23rd of April. We've got a copy if you want to get a copy, or we can send you to the link. But basically a very favorable report. They went back and reviewed the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, RCRA as we call it, rules. Those deal with wastes, industrial wastes. And they made the determination that the states over the last 6 years have been very active in updating their waste rules, and that there's no reason at this point in time for EPA to rewrite any of those rules. So let's talk about that. the oil and gas industry generates a lot of waste. Number one is produced water. And so in North Dakota, we generate about 1.5 barrels of produced water for every barrel of oil, meaning that we're closing in on 2 million barrels of water every day that has to be produced and safely handled and disposed of. That's the number one waste stream, and that's typical of all the states. And so this report looked at what have states done with their produced water handling rules. The number two waste is drill cuttings. And then number three is the T-norm contaminated waste. And so they looked at those three major categories in this report, and they were able to determine that the states that have 99% of US production have all updated their rules in all these areas over the last 6 years, and that EPA does not need to update their oversight or reclassify any of those oil and gas wastes to a different subtitle. Long story, sorry, but it's a long write-up and it's going to leave the director's cut. So I wanted to tell you what that underlined portion meant, and also let you know, I think the report runs to about 185 pages, but we'll sure send you an electronic copy if you'd like one. It's got some kind of cool graphs and pictures and maps and charts in it. So it's got some good visual stuff. That's everything I directly wanted to talk about, Katie and folks. So let's open it up for questions.
I'd like to start by just asking, going back to the Washington State lawsuit. July 28th is the effective date. Is the discussion, if you could talk about it, to go for an injunction right away?
So the question was, with the effective date of July 28th, is the discussion going for an injunction right away? And I don't know for certain, but I would say that that's unlikely. The way the legislation was designed is that it doesn't kick in for 2 years. So, and in fact, it doesn't kick in except on new facilities or any facility that increases its crude by rail more than 10% over last year's volume. Then it triggers for that facility, but it triggers 2 years later. So an injunction, to get an injunction, you have to be able to show real and present harm. And because there's the 2-year delay, not likely. It's being investigated, but it's not likely, Dave.
Do you want to go over break-even pricing?
Oh, I sure do. Thanks for mentioning that. So we did provide at the very end the break-evens again. As you can see, with the better oil prices and the new completion technology, there's almost nowhere that you can drill in North Dakota that you can't make money. I mean, it's virtually, there isn't enough data on Bowman and Slope or Golden Valley to update those. I'm sure those prices will come down when we begin to get some drilling there. But overall, virtually everywhere is economic. And in fact, the break-even prices have dropped a little bit because the new completions have such high IP rates and higher recovery rates. And so you can see that with a current and these are all equated to WTI prices. So with a current price of $62, there's only 3 counties where you would want to be careful about where you drilled in North Dakota. With outside of that, every single place that you could drill a Bakken or Three Forks well, it's going to be robustly economic to drill in North Dakota. So thanks for mentioning that. We try to update that once a quarter. Yeah.
Could you elaborate on the workforce needs? Are companies finding workers to fill those frac crews?
Thanks, Amy. So the question was the workforce and our companies finding the people they need. My understanding is on the frac crew side, the answer is yes, that they are able to find people with the CDLs and workers to man the frac crews. But on the other side, gas plant technicians, pumpers and switchers and gaugers and all those people. There's over 1,800 job openings and continue to be. And the operators are really struggling to fill those. So we're trying to come up with some new and innovative programs through the Career and Technical Education Department in state government. Also, Governor Burgum has asked the Interstate Oil and Gas Compact Commission to put together a workforce task force to look at what are the various states doing. And we're partnering closely with Texas. I think in August when we meet in Medora, we're going to ask the commissioner from Texas to talk about their efforts down there. But what I'm hearing is every state with the shale play has a workforce shortage. And so we're actually starting to look at how could we begin to train people as juniors and seniors in high school to collect their high school diploma and have some college credits in this area through CTE or something like that, and be able to, you know, walk across the stage on Sunday and onto a job site on Monday. So that's where we're headed with it. But we've got 1,800 job openings, and we're expecting to have to grow the workforce next year and the following year by 3,500 people. So it's only going to get tighter.
Do you have a couple questions on here? Is there any estimate or an updated estimate on any self-restriction that's happening due to gas capture since the last time we talked about it?
That's a great question. Self-restriction. So I ran the numbers, and actually they unself-restricted in in March, and you can see it reflected in the gas capture numbers. There was little to no restraint imposed by the oil companies, and so Caitlin's working the numbers, but she said it looks like she has a boatload of in two areas under the Industrial Commission policy. The primary area being plant constraints, capacity constraint letters. So a ton of filings for exemptions under the capacity constraint thing. And I think I've talked about the fact that as plant capacity comes on this year and towards the end of the year, we're really strongly looking at doing away with that. But at this point in time, that is a huge need of the industry. And then the other part is flowback or initial testing. So we saw in the last half of March a lot of new completions. And so you saw things like that 10,000 barrel a day well produced over 27 million cubic feet a day of natural gas. And it flared that because it had the new well testing flowback. You know, it's allowed to do that for 2 weeks for well testing, and then you know, an additional 6 weeks or so of flow testing. And so Caitlin had a huge number of capacity curtailment letters and flowback applications that she processed. So it doesn't right now look like, other than a few very small producers, that there would be any production restrictions, but we're watching it, and like I said, we think that as plant capacity comes online, we're going to have to roll back that capacity curtailment thing. But there wasn't any restraint exercised in March.
I have a point of clarification hoping you can make, and then also there's a question with it. So the question is related to one of the Hess wells that had IP'd at 16,000 barrels per day. So maybe some clarification on BOE versus barrels per day, if there's some differences there. And so, and then also if that 10,000 barrels is a sustained rate that we might be able to see in some of the new enhanced fracking.
Mm-hmm. So we'll take the first thing first, and that's a great question. Oftentimes people express their IPs in BOEs, which is barrels of oil equivalent. What they do is they take the gas production and divide it by 6, because that's the BTU ratio, and then they add that to the oil production to get BOEs. And so, yeah, I always just talk in oil, especially since during the first 2 weeks to 45 days, they're going to flare the gas. So, but I get it. You know, ultimately that their plan is to connect that thing and run it to the Tioga gas plant, and they're expanding that. And then the second part of the question was sustained rates. Yes, I think, you know, if you looked at some of the work Justin's been doing, those wells are sustaining those kind of high rates. They still decline much more rapidly than conventional wells, but they're starting out 50% higher than they IP'd at last year. And 9 months later, they're still producing 50% higher than a 9-month-old well did a year ago. So the completions are really holding up and sustaining significantly higher production rates.
Last question, because of this, do you feel the core of the play is expanding at all?
Great question. And yes, it is interesting that one company in particular, and I believe it was Marathon, had some older acreage over in the Little Knife area that was pretty marginal a generation or two ago in terms of completions. It would not be, it'd be break even at best at those kind of production rates. But they've gone down there now and drilled 2 wells. And in that case, both of those wells have been 75 to 100% more productive than when they left that area 3 years ago. So what people are calling the core, and so you've heard it from several of the operators, Continental and Marathon in particular, that the core area has now expanded to where this 4th generation completion technology is really moving that core out, in some cases, 40 or 50 miles.
Thank you. Any last questions for Lynn? All right.
Thanks, everyone. So how we start when you got to eat the chemistry you brought? Cookies.
I guess I didn't get that right.
They dropped that class. In
Yep.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Justin Kringstad, Director of the North Dakota Pipeline Authority. We'll get right into our update, looking again, not only North Dakota, neighboring states, eastern Montana, South Dakota. Again, nothing real new to report there. We are seeing some fairly steady, maybe slightly down volumes in those neighboring states. Again, our pipeline network does share the same system with those states. We do keep a close eye on what's taking place. And then just some historical data for reference. Again, looking at that month-over-month change, I'm not sure if Lynn had mentioned this or not. This was the single largest month-over-month gain in natural gas volume compared to historically. It was not the largest month-over-month gain for crude oil, but it was for natural gas. It was definitely top 5 on the oil side, though. When we look at transportation dynamics leaving the region, fairly steady on the pipeline market share as well as the refining market share, where we are continuing to see some very small fluctuations are in the truck and rail volumes taking place within the region. So again, slide 6, the first thing we'll quickly look at is that dotted line, the Brent WTI spread has continued to be at a level what I consider high enough to attract barrels onto the rail network. And so we're going to continue to see volumes electing to move out of North Dakota by rail car. You can see again the market share though is primarily or dominant on the pipeline side of the world, right around 72% of the oil moving out by pipeline. And then that rail market share and then the trucking market share that you see in green continuing those very small fluctuations. When we look at the volumes, again, we saw that dip down in production as well as rail traffic in the month of February. with the production uptick in March, we did see those volumes rebound slightly. So still somewhere in the neighborhood of about 260,000 barrels per day estimated to be leaving North Dakota by rail car. And the destination, again, the question of where that oil is headed. The East Coast PADD 5 market continues to be the dominant destination, 61% in February as estimated by the EIA. And then the remainder going to the East Coast, and in the month of February, basically no volumes continuing to go down to the PADD 3 or the Gulf Coast region. Look at pricing for February. Again, you can see maybe why, just some of the pricing dynamics that were taking place in February. PADD 1, PADD 5, East and West Coast, highest priced market. PADD 3 down in the Gulf lagged those other two coastal refining centers. And so, again, no surprise when you have that flexibility on a rail car, they're going to continue to move to the highest priced markets. And where we sit today, just to maybe give us some vision going forward, the Brent WTI spread has gone up slightly. So now we're nearing that $10 range. So we were in an environment of that $6 to $8 range for quite some time, and we've seen it creeping upwards. Again, that's going to make the crude by rail economics look more attractive to those shippers. In that they're going to look at where they can get the highest price value for that crude oil and what mode of transportation options they have to get it there. And again, for PADD 1 and PADD 5, crude by rail is the only market, or the only transportation mode available to those shippers. The truck traffic back and forth with Canada, the Federal Trade Commission did catch up when we were lagging and behind late last year. They now are up to speed with March data. So in March, almost hand in hand. So those numbers kind of came much closer together, the amount of truck traffic going north and the volumes coming south through the North Dakota ports. Now switching gears to natural gas. Again, as Lynn alluded to, 80% gas capture. That remaining 20%, we saw no change in the 4% on the volume of gas being flared from wells that are connected. Again, it's that orange piece of the pie, the wells that do have a pipeline connection, but the volumes are just at a level that the systems cannot move all the gas to market. We look back historically, that continues to be our dominant challenge, and I expect that it will continue to be for the foreseeable future. The challenge is going to continue to remain those connected locations. How do they expand existing systems, enhance all aspects of the gathering and processing stream in order to get more molecules moving downstream. We look at activity. Again, how quickly are wells getting connected out there? Good news in March. Number of new wells selling gas did outpace the new number of wells producing gas. So good news on the speed of gathering. And then when we look forward, this is a graphic that Lynn was alluding to in some of his conversation. When we look going forward, again, what you're looking at is my production forecast. My red scenario is my expected case. That gray line where they fork is my conservative case. So using my expected scenario, it won't be until late this year under that case 1 that gas processing capacity will catch up. And you'll notice it is a very short window in time with where we see gas volumes growing here in 2019. Long term, again, the almost $4 billion that are being invested in this batch of processing facilities, new pipeline assets, is going to get the industry through the next year or two. But when we get into the early 2020s, there will need to be substantial new investment in gas capture, gathering facilities, processing, as well as transmission pipelines in order to stay on top of this challenge. So with that, I'd be glad to answer any questions.
Any questions here in the room for Justin?
So WBI announced, of course, the North Bakken expansion.
Mm-hmm.
How is that going to affect things?
Yeah, so the question for those online was about the WBI North Bakken pipeline system. So when you look at the full process of getting a molecule of gas from the wellhead to us as consumers, the first phase has been the gathering and the processing, and that has historically been North Dakota's biggest challenge. Transmission, at least to date, hasn't been a major constraint point for North Dakota. Going forward, it will be. And so WBI, looking ahead at growth potential north of Lake Skakawea, seeing interest for new processing capacity. You saw the announcement by Hess for an additional 150 million of processing capacity. The existing system cannot handle any new processing capacity. So WBI is stepping up with new transmission capacity so that new gas processing plants can be constructed north of Lake Skakawea. So as interest and activity continues northward, that project will be vitally important to the gas capture.
Do you remember the timing on that? I was trying to think and I just.
Late 2021, yeah. Coinciding very closely with that Hess expansion. Yeah.
Well, when do you think we would eventually need a second long hauler transmission crude line out of North Dakota? Being asked kind of a second version of Dakota Access or some of those larger lines.
Yeah, and so great question. I don't have a graphic. I usually speak in graphics for those that follow my work. Looking forward, currently we're in an environment where crude oil production does exceed pipeline capacity. So the only two projects that are in the proposed phase right now would be the Liberty pipeline system as well as the refinery out in western North Dakota. Those two projects alone would not be enough to meet future growth for crude oil in North Dakota. So companies are looking at either enhancing existing assets. Can they add horsepower? Can they add loop strategic sections of that pipeline system? And then the other option would be, if necessary, a new build. And again, long term, the Gulf Coast, Cushing continue to look like the primary destinations. Again, with the export optionality in the Gulf, it makes sense for folks in North Dakota to again look at the Gulf. It's a natural fit, large capacity to handle growing volumes, not only from Permian and Texas production, but as well North Dakota long term.
Thank you. Any last questions for Justin?
So are you saying you're a graphic novelist?
All right. I think that's it.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.